you want to take a photograph of my desk? With
Sure.
Manuscripts?
Sure.
That could work with you for the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Where do you work at?
In my paper.
Oh, okay.
When my wife was alive, I worked here,
Mm-hmm.
so I could be near her in her study. So that you want to do the photograph now? Or?
Sure.
It's up to you. I don't mean to.
Oh, no, you're
do
fine. Yeah, no, that's a good
guide you
idea.
in any way. This is where I work,
Oh, cool.
and that's my manuscript in progress.
Mm-hmm.
This is my typewriter. This is
What kind of typewriter is that?
Well, it says award, but it's a Hermes.
Okay.
But the guy imported them and put his
Mhm.
own brand on them. I have 2 of those, and they're unbelievable. I've been working on it. I probably wrote 15 books on that, and without getting it repaired.
Mm-hmm.
This is my page in progress, 316 and 317.
Cool.
It's a little warm in here, so I'm going to turn the air conditioner on.
Okay. I'm not worried about you. I'm more worried about myself.
You
But-
should never feel embarrassed with me.
All right. Well, that's good
You
then.
know, whatever, you know. You say you want to publish books, but how would you go about doing that?
Publish my own books or publish?
Books by other writers.
Oh, well, we've published a few now.
What?
We've published a few books now.
Actual print books?
Yeah, print books. I would have brought you one, but I didn't have any at my house. My sister has them all.
Have you had any luck with them?
I mean, they get put on some small lists and stuff, and reviewed a couple small places and stuff, but nothing big.
Any place for me would be better than what I've gone through with the last 2 books.
Yeah, and we have low expectations for. I mean, just because we're so small, but
Yeah.
but we like doing it. We just, I don't know. We hope that we're treating the authors well and stuff.
Well, the author's grateful that you published it. And then they become ungrateful that you didn't do it after.
Yeah, that's true. No, we've been lucky enough though that
What did you say?
we've been lucky to work with kind people.
Yeah, but then they know how
Thank you.
tough it is.
Yeah, you said this was going to be your last interview.
Yeah,
Do you think that's true?
yeah. You know, somebody's writing a book about me.
Oh yeah?
I didn't tell you. His name is
no.
Matthew Petty. He's a professor at the University of District of Columbia. And about 9 months ago, he called me up and he said, he just wants to ask me one thing. Do I have a biographer? I said, are you kidding? And he says, he says, well, I want to be your biographer. He really likes my work.
Mm-hmm.
And so he comes every 2 weeks, usually on a Thursday, sometimes on a Wednesday. He comes from DC and he brings hummus and carrots and celery, and then I alternately provide the refreshments.
Mm-hmm.
And he says it's going well.
So you just talk about your whole life and
whatever,
stuff?
yeah, whatever he
Mm-hmm.
thinks should be in a biography.
The first thing I wrote down was what street did you grow up on, and what was your neighborhood like when you were growing up?
Well,
You grew up in New York,
I was
right?
born in Brooklyn,
Mhm.
and when I was about a year old, the family moved to West 75th Street. The number of the building was 29 West 75th Street. And the family owned that brownstone up until about 5 years ago. After my mother died, she lived there to the end. And so I lived there from 1937 to 1959 when I moved out and got a job in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
as a reporter. And I moved back to West 75th Street years later in 19 1965 to help my mother with my father, who had the same thing that I have now, same disease, Parkinson's, but much worse.
Mm-hmm.
And he also had diabetes, and so I had to give him shots and take care of him. So we spelled each other, my mother and I. So I got an apartment on the same block. I was very lucky, at 5 West 75th Street. But I lived at 29 West 75th Street as a boy. I went to public school, PS 87, on West 78th Street. Graduated in the 8th grade and went to Brooklyn Tech for half a year, and then to Dewey Clinton High School, and then to City College. What was my neighborhood? My neighborhood was like a neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
We played stickball in the streets. Everybody had roller skates. I didn't have any roller skates. Most of the kids had bicycles. I didn't have a bike. We started off having some means because my father was a dentist,
Mm-hmm.
and they bought the building, 29 West 75th Street, so he could have his office in the front. But he got in trouble with the law
Mm-hmm.
and was in prison,
Yeah, I was going to ask you about
Sing
that.
Sing,
too.
for a year and a half. And so the family, my mother went out to work. She was an interior decorator, so she worked in Macy's in the furniture department. And then my father got out of prison, and the war was ending. But he got a job in a war factory, working as a worker, and then got a job selling materials for linings of men's jackets and coats. And after about 10 years, he got his license back.
Mm-hmm.
So he opened up a new office on West 40th Street, 200 West 40th Street. It didn't do too well there, you know. And then he got MS, and then he got Parkinson's, and so he had to close the office.
Mm-hmm.
But you asked what the neighborhood was like. It was fun.
Mm-hmm.
There were lots of kids on the block, of all, you know, sort of everybody. What I want to say is, you know, there was rich and poor. New York was affordable then. We lived half a block from Columbus Avenue, which had your butcher, your baker, your candy store, your candlestick maker probably,
Mm-hmm.
if you looked hard enough. Even had a 5 and dime, Kaminsky's 5 and dime. So
And what was your father put in prison for? Was it for giving abortion?
for extortion,
Oh, okay.
he was. It had to do with abortion was illegal,
Mm-hmm.
and so he would make the contact. He was all a dentist. He knew
Mhm.
lots of doctors for women to have abortions. But he also did illegal stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
and then extorted money from doctors who didn't want their abortion business to be revealed.
Mm-hmm.
So he was brought up on the Lower East Side. He knew lots of criminals. He was a tough guy, my father,
Mm-hmm.
but also gentle. But it was only when I grew older that I realized my father was a real tough cookie.
Mm-hmm.
So
Cool. This was just a funny one I was thinking about. But did you have a favorite book as a kid, or did you even read much when you were?
I read comic books a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and my favorite book was Home Run Hennessy. It was a sports book, and I liked sort of novels about sports characters.
Mm-hmm.
I was also a big Jackie Robinson fan, so I read all about Jackie Robinson. I didn't read as much as my closest older brother,
Mhm.
Jimmy, the one who died in a freighter coming back from Europe. So I had 3 older brothers, and the 2 oldest were so much older than I that I didn't have much to do with them. until I got a job in Washington through my brother Don, who was a reporter in Washington, and somebody needed a reporter for 2 weeks, and I had worked for NBC News while I was in college as a copy boy, and so I got the job for 2 weeks and stayed on for a couple of years, and then went on in Washington as a reporter covering Congress and mostly radio stuff. And then got a job in New York. When my brother died, I didn't want to go back to Washington, so I stayed in New York and got a job with Fawcett Publications editing 2 detective magazines, which is an awful job. And then my brother Don, now he was working for CBS, he told me about a job at CBS. So I got a job at CBS News as an editor. And when that job folded, the show went off the air, it was called In Person. I had a little money, so I decided to write seriously with the money that I saved.
And I read in some of your bios online and stuff, it says that your brother Jimmy said something about how like you have to finish the story.
One day I had my apartment in D.C. at 1875 Mintwood Place, and Jimmy came and stayed with me. And I said, I've been writing short stories, and he was a short story writer, and a bona fide one. I had been writing short stories for a couple of years. He said, well, let me see them. So I gave him about 10 stories that I had started, had first drafts of. And I hear him, this must be in a couple of interviews, I hear him sort of making noises, I thought, and Jimmy had a heart murmur. And so I went in thinking something was wrong. And he was laughing at my stories. He said, these are good, some better than others, but one thing you have to learn how to do is write an ending, finish the stories. And so I started finishing my stories.
And then I'll try not to ask you too many.
You can ask me anything.
Okay, well, I was going to ask, how do you know when you're done with a story? Or do you is it just...
Well, I write my stories, first draft, I write in one sitting, usually. 90% of them have been written in one sitting. Usually takes half an hour to an hour. 5 pages, 10 pages, 15 pages. So I have the basis and the skeleton for a short story. And now the trick is, does the story stay with me for the next day when I start refining the story? And, start from page 1 of my first draft and see if it and work to the end, which could take a month, could take 2 months, could take 2 weeks. But if I feel good after I finish the first draft, I said, yeah, you got a story here. And I start rewriting it, writing it from the beginning with what I have to the end.
And do you just start over on the typewriter with your first draft next to you?
That's right.
And did you ever try to move? I don't actually I use a typewriter too when I write.
I try to use a computer, no.
Yeah.
I have more trouble writing on a computer than I have in writing anything. I can't even work on an electric typewriter. Of course, now with my arthritis and my Parkinson's, I'm having a little trouble typing. I don't have the dexterity that I used to have with my fingers. So in the old days, I used to write a page, let's say I had the first draft and I start with page 1. I would write that page 1 20, 30, 40 times until I felt, okay, it's good. But in the back of my mind, making sure that I'm not overwriting, that I'm not embellishing to a fault. So I would write that first page 10, 20, 30 times until I say, okay, you can't help the story anymore. You can only hurt it or you could do one or the other, but go on to page 2. So now, because of the limited time I'm able to work on a typewriter, I only rewrite that page once, twice, at the most 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
But I read that page a lot more times than I used to read the page before. In other words, before I would retype page 1 and then put it in again, read it and retype it and retype it 30 times. It's not an exaggeration.
Mm-hmm.
Now I have the first draft, page 1, and I start the final draft. This is only in the last couple of years,
Mm-hmm.
2-3 years. And I try to make that final draft done in one page, in one day, in one page.
Mm-hmm.
So usually it takes 2 pages, at the most 3. So my tactics, my writing, what do you call it? The mechanics
Mm-hmm.
of my writing has changed. It's changed from the 30-page, one-page story, one page,
Mm-hmm.
30, rewriting of 30 pages, and I write those 30 pages in one day.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, now I couldn't write 30 pages in 3 days because of my physical limitations.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a good question, but I think my writing hasn't suffered from it.
I don't think so either.
Well, I've been writing so long, 60 years,
Mm-hmm.
of just about every day in the last 60 years, I've worked on my typewriters. So,
Your writing has changed in a good way.
Sure.
I mean, it's just,
oh,
it's not the same thing over and over. It's like there's different parts of your career that.
but I am doing
differently.
stories over. In other words,
Mhm.
I've been concentrating sometimes on a story that I've already told, but I tell it in a different way. For instance,
Mhm.
The Breakup, which was based on a breakup that I had with my wife, Anne,
Mm-hmm.
when she left me at my 29 West 35th Street, which was, actually I moved back to that building. And she said, this is not going to work. So I've written that story. Once I call it The Breakup, another story is Another Breakup.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and that's in Out of Time, right? Or one of those versions.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I've noticed that reoccurring events and stuff in that collection, and
Yeah, there's one, for instance, she lived at 425 Riverside Drive, an apartment building in the Columbia University area. And one time we were living separately, but we're lovers. We'd see each other every day. I would go back to my apartment and then come back to hers. And one day I came to her floor, 7th floor, got off the elevator, and hear her playing the piano, Brahms Intermezzo. And it was beautiful. Well, I've written that story in different ways,
Mhm.
about 3 times. I don't think any writer's ever done that.
I don't think so either.
But I do it because I get deeper and deeper into the story, and because the emotion of that event, of hearing Anne play the piano and waiting till she stops playing before I ring the bell, or if I have a key to her apartment before I open the door, because I don't want to interrupt her. So it just seems by rewriting it, it's a different story.
Mm-hmm. And when you, as a reader, it kind of lives in your head in a different way too.
If the
Longer
reader has
because you
read
keep reading it
each
different
version.
ways. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've gotten some feedback from some people saying, didn't I read that story before? As if the person has read it in a magazine. I said, no, you read it in a book. And now you're going to read it again. And now you've read it in another book.
Yeah, I was reading Frog for the first time while I was reading Out of Time. And sometimes I would sort of, and I don't think, this isn't meant to be a criticism. I think it's kind of a neat thing, but sometimes I would forget which was happening and which, but it didn't, I don't mean that in a negative way, but.
All right.
Yeah.
It's a tricky book.
Frog? But it's not as daunting. It's
right.
daunting when you look at it and you're like, that's a 769-page book, but when you're reading it, each chapter, it's kind of like a refresh button. It's like you're...
Yeah, and it starts off with a collection of short stories.
Mm-hmm.
and there was a novel in it, novellas.
Yeah, it was a lot scarier to me before I started reading it, and then once I started reading it,
it's a beautiful looking book the way they packaged it.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about. You're Jewish, right?
Yes.
Did you grow up going to temple or anything like that, or just?
Well, mostly the high holy days.
Mm-hmm.
And fasting on Yom Kippur. And I was bar mitzvahed in an Orthodox temple, so I had to learn to read Hebrew and even to know what some of the words meant. I've forgotten all that. But being a student at a synagogue was not a great experience. The teachers were rabbis, and they were very strict. And they would actually use a pointer to whack your hand. It was sort of what you hear about people who Catholics, who study at parochial schools. Also the tough nuns, where we had the tough rabbis. So the high holy days, we went through the traditional rituals. But other than that, and for summer, for about 6 years, I went to a Jewish camp, which had kosher food and followed Jewish traditions. And my father was Orthodox, Orthodox Jew, which he stopped being once his mother died 2 months before I was born. So my name was supposed to be Peter Anthony. In the Jewish tradition, you named the new child with the first letter of a deceased person. So I was named after Sarah. So they changed from Peter Anthony to Stephen Bruce because of Sarah, who died exactly 2 months before I was, April 6, 1936, before I was born.
Wow. So
I was brought up, raised a Jew. And my wife was Jewish. And the only times where we celebrated Christmas by exchanging gifts with the kids, and she also lit Hanukkah candles.
I was raised Catholic, but my mom is Jewish. She converted to Catholicism when she married my dad, so my whole mom's side of the family is Jewish. But
so technically
I am a Jew. Yeah.
Well, at least the Jews consider you a Jew.
You
could emigrate to Israel if you wanted.
I know.
Just don't tell me your mother converted.
I know. I think that this is my last year to get to do that for free. I think it's like 26 or 25 is the cutoff. I didn't know there was cutoff.
I didn't know there was a time.
I was going to ask you about. I don't really have a good question about it, but that story in Frog Made Free.
Frog Made Free.
Where it just begins on that boxcar. I mean.
Yeah.
That took me off guard the other day.
And I've gotten complaints, which I've answered. How could he be on a boxcar in 1944, let's say, when he was born in 1936? I mean, how could he be a father?
And I don't even think about that.
Yeah. I say, well, what I do is I use the character and his situation, his family. I just place him in a different time frame. Just once here, once there.
But it works, yeah.
Yeah, that was a strong story.
It really was, yeah.
I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah, that one I don't know, something about the way, I forget what story that came after, but.
There was also that last line when the guy says to Howard Tetch, I have nobody.
Yeah, he's patting him on the back.
Yeah, I have nobody. So he understands. And it was written, I guess, to bring some understanding to what something like that could mean. Imagine losing your daughters, and that's what Howard is dreaming or thinking of. That's where the story comes from. If he was living with the same woman, same children, but 30 years prior, 30 years after. Anyway, you know.
Yeah, and it makes sense that like that you would put yourself in that position,
Yeah.
especially if you're Jewish and you think, what would I do in that situation?
Yeah. What could he do?
Yeah. I was going to ask you. Oh, is it true that you still send a story to the New Yorker or every year?
No, I probably sent my last story to the New Yorker a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
I started sending to them when my Paris Review story was accepted in 1961. So I probably sent to them for about 50 years. And then I went to Paris in 64. I would send them stories from Paris. And I had many editors. Robert Hemingway, Hemmen, Hemenway, who was a short story writer. He was my first editor there. I say my first editor. He wasn't my editor, but he just sort of looked at my stories and turned them down. And Francis Kiernan, and God knows who else. No, it's ridiculous. They've probably rejected 150 stories of mine over the last year, and some of my best work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would send them nothing, but well, I like all my work, but these are stories that I thought, reading the New Yorker, having read the New Yorker, would work. They were either funny or sad, but I can only explain it by saying or thinking that after they reject a few stories of yours, you're never going to be accepted. Because they're unable to deal with the fact that they rejected you before for so many times. But then I knew Roger Angel from Maine. You know who he is?
Mm-hmm.
And he told me that he used to reject stories by John Updike and John Cheever. But of course they took stories by John Updike and John Cheever. Yeah, my whole writing life would have been different if the New Yorker had started taking stories of mine early on and then would take one or two a year.
Mm-hmm.
Would have been enough money to live. Yeah, so I don't send to them anymore. In fact, I don't send out to many magazines anymore. I sent Paris Review my last story. Remember, Paris Review has published, I think, four of my stories, but not for a long time. Not since 85, 86. So that would be my last. I have a lot of lasts in my life. So that would be my last Paris Review story. Harper's has been good to me. Published about 4 or 5 of my stories, if not more. And so I send to Ellen Rosenbusch, the editor there, hoping that she'll take a story because they pay a lot and it's a good place to get published. The only literary magazines that seem to be interested in my work now are the Agni Review and the Idaho Review. But nobody else seems to be interested, which is okay. You know, I've published a lot. I published about 600 stories.
And I was going to ask you, let's see where.
Yeah.
Well, you were saying that.
Let me just add to the New Yorker.
Yeah, sure.
The reason I don't send to them anymore, just help yourself if you want.
Sure.
It's because it's hopeless. And so I'd be sort of a little crazy to continue to submit to a situation that I know is hopeless. And somebody else will say, well, why do you think it's hopeless? I mean, how do you know that they won't suddenly like the story, the newest story? I said, because it's 150 stories later. And what are they going to say? And what am I going to say? Well, it's congratulations, Steve, you got a story published in New Yorker. And I would say, yeah, after 150 stories. So it looks bad for both of us. So.
You said that there's a lot of lasts for you lately.
Yeah.
How does that feel for you? And that also makes me think about that's a heavy question, but
no, it's not. I could answer it.
And that makes me think about the title of Out of Time too.
Yeah, because early on I had a collection called Time to Go. I remember I did the cover for it, which they didn't accept, which was a little girl, Sophia, when she was not even a year old, with a watch, a big watch on, Time to Go. I have plenty of time to go. She has plenty of time to go. and now it's out of time, meaning I'm out of time. I'm still writing, but I'm gradually going out of time, getting out of time. What would be the expression? I'll soon be out of time. And so when there are lots of this is the last interview, and if it doesn't work out,
it'll work out.
Well,
I emailed the editor last night, and he's excited about it.
Yeah, well, that's nice. And I think this is the last book I'm writing too. I'm on page 316 and 17, and it could be the last book because it'll probably go on, as I might have told you before, forever. It's not a book that has an ending. It's comprised of a whole bunch of, and I've changed the title again. Remember I said it was supposed to be half stories
full
full novel. Then I changed it to stories without end. And I don't like that anymore because it's too much like a man without qualities. So I think half stories, verbal, full novel is what it is. Meaning that none of the stories have to end, but all together they present a life. You know, and so enough. I've done endings enough, and my endings have always been easy for me to do. Of course, I don't like abrupt endings. I mean, I like abrupt endings, but I don't like, sort of fake endings. What I want to say. Endings where you know that's the end of the story. So I have all these half stories, three-quarter stories that are not the end, but they have no endings. And it's fun, and it takes a little pressure off me to sort of write a story with an end. I just have to write a story or a part of a story where a man's life materializes on the page but doesn't necessarily complete itself. The story doesn't complete itself, the man's life. It could be anything. So yes, I think this is my last book. And if I suddenly get a heart attack and can't write anymore or die, the instructions for the book will be go back to the last completed half story. Of course, each half story starts off with a title. The one I'm working on now is called The Loser. And it starts off with the words, he loses his wife again. And he loses her at a party. So go back to the end of the last complete half story, and that's where the book ends. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. So the book has there's no wind-up, no significant ending. But you come out, knowing the guy who holds the book together, which makes it a novel. He's in every story. And last, what else? That's it, last submissions to certain magazines. I mean, why send to magazines that send me back anonymous rejection slips? Or where you can tell, for instance, the New England Review, which published about 4 or 5 of my stories in the last 2-3 years. I could tell by what they're saying that they're not interested in my work anymore. So why bother them? And why bother going through the process of submitting a story when you know it's not going to, well, you almost know it's not going to be accepted. But I can tell by what they say. So Agnew Review is still enthusiastic, so they still, and Idaho Review has been wonderful. This guy, Mitch something Land, Wieland, Wieland, he's been great. I send him a story and he takes it. Or he says, this story is 10 pages longer than that we can publish. So I send him a story that's 10 pages shorter. And I think those are the only 2 magazines that are still interested. Paris Review, when the editor was at the Southern Review, she was interested. You know that she's what's her name? Emily Nevins.
Oh, at the Paris Review.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ashley sent them a story.
Well, on her own?
Well, she had a writer who was friends with her say, I told Emily to look out for your story.
Well,
she got a rejection, but...
Oh, she did?
Yeah.
Well...
A handwritten rejection.
Joined the club.
Yeah.
She's very nice, Emily. So she actually should try again. So, I've run out of magazines. Except your magazine,
And just me in general. But how does that feel? It's just the way it is.
It's fine. I'm old enough to accept that, and I think it's sort of humorous, too, to having written for 60 years, 600 or so published stories, and then to still face the rejection squad. I mean, it used to be where when I was 20, 30 years ago, I would send out 20 submissions before I would get one acceptance. And then it became 10 and then 5. And now it looks like, well, it's back to 20. But I mean, how that couldn't bother me. I just say, well, they don't want it, so on with it. And so I'm sending out fewer stories. Who did I? Oh, I recently sent one to Harper's, because there's always a chance with them. And there seem to be fewer magazines too.
And these are all sent physically, right? Physically, like manuscript pages, right? Never.
Yes, never online. That doesn't help me, but I've never been able to figure out how to send a story online. Besides, it would mean I'd have to type it into the computer, and that would be too hard for me. I've been working on manual typewriters for so many years. It's home for my fingers.
Make sure this is still going. Cool. What was I going to ask you? Oh, another thing that always shows up in all of your bios and stuff online is all these different kinds of jobs you worked in. School bus driver and bartender and
Bartender, waiter.
What was it? I mean, did you have a favorite of those, or did they all blend together?
My best job I ever had was my first real job. I mean, I did lots of work while I was in high school and in college. I went to evening school for 2 to 3 years and day school for about 2. So I had lots of jobs during that time in New York City. But the best job I ever had was the job that I had as a reporter in Washington from 59 through 61. I mean, I was interviewing, which you've seen in the brief bios, Khrushchev, Johnson, LBJ, RFK, JFK, all the alphabetized famous people. And that was the best job because suddenly I was thrown. I mean, I'd done no reporting when I was working for CBS. Not when I worked as a copyboy for NBC. I just tore stories off the machine and gave them to reporters to write, to rewrite. And I remember we were in an elevator and I was on my way to Mexico to live and to write. And I was in an elevator with my brother Don, who was a reporter in Washington. And in steps Herbert Gordon and Don Bowers, who had started their own news service, called News Associates Radio Press. And they had worked with Don at INS, International News Service. So they said, hi, and he said, we're looking for a guy to fill in for a reporter who's going on vacation for 2-3 weeks. If you know anybody, well, you know the end of the story. Don says, well, Steve worked for NBC News. He didn't say I was a copy boy. I mean, the most I wrote was weather reports, NBC News. And so they said, well, then, show up tomorrow for 2 weeks. And I stayed on for 2 years. And that was the best job. It was so exciting. I remember again, it was at the same building, not in an elevator, where the National Press Club was. And I see Kenneth Keating, who was a senator from New York, and Emanuel Sella, who was a congressman from New York and head of the Judiciary Committee. And I was with I. Herbert Gordon, who ran News Associates and Radio Press. He says, there's Keating and Sella. He says, get a story from them. And I had a a tape recorder. So what am I supposed to say? Just ask them questions about the newest bills. And so they were in a limousine because they furnished the chairman of the Judiciary Committee with a limousine. So I say, Congressman Sellers, Chairman Sellers, and he says, oh, you want a story? He says, get in the car. So I was sitting with Keating on one side and Emanuel Sella, Kenneth Keating and Emanuel Sella on the other side. And I began asking them, about bills that are coming up and how do they think. And Eisenhower was the president then. So do you think you could pass the bill with Eisenhower? Whatever the story was. And that's how I got my first story. Actually, my first story was when they had me cover the convention of the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution. And so, because Eisenhower wasn't supposed to speak. I was just supposed to go around and get interviews with women from Virginia, for a Virginia station that we had, from Texas, for 2 stations we had in Texas, in Dallas and Houston. And suddenly they hear that Eisenhower is going to speak to the women at the DAR convention. And so the first story I had was a story about myself, because they threw me out, because I was so new to Washington that I didn't have the credentials that a reporter is supposed to have. So by the time I got back to the office, I said, I didn't get a story. He said, you are the story. It came on the teletype machine. Reporter is thrown out of... I'm not kidding. That was my first story. That was the best job because it was exciting, and I could roam the House and the Senate, and I met all these well-known politicians. And it was an interesting time in Washington because it was the Democrats, and LBJ was the majority leader. And there was a lot of confrontation between the Democrats and Eisenhower. So it was a good time.
It's got to be weird to think about that time and then think about the time we are in now with the joke that politics has become, kind of. Let's see, what else I got here for you? Well, something that happens when you read enough of your work is that
when you read what?
When I read enough, when someone reads enough of your work, is that, and then they start to learn about your real life. I mean, those kind of blend together.
Yeah, they do.
I mean, I know that's not. I know fiction is fiction, and
it didn't used to be that way. But the more I wrote, the more I got involved in my own life, as a situation or as a characterization. It just happened until now. I get almost, even though the stories have imagination. Things that didn't happen to me. They're sort of, the story is sort of about me, what I think, and what I do, and then, I change it around, but it became more and more like that. When I first started writing, although I wrote stuff about myself, a lot of the stories, which weren't very good stories, were stories that I entirely made up. For instance, during the 60s with Vietnam, I wrote several, not lots, of political stories. And they're not as interesting as the stories that I could, because they're not about a person who really lived. Am I making myself clear?
Yeah, definitely.
When I write about myself and situations I'm in, like simple stories like breakups, it comes with a whole fuselage of emotion because I've lived it, rather than sort of mentally or fantastically lived it. They're not made up. And well, the book I'm writing now, Half Stories, it starts with a single line, each story, and then I see what happens. In other words, I let it roll.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's sort of a cross between my interior life and the exterior life that I imagine.
Do you ever think about that, like now for the reader, if that doesn't matter to you, does it? Like that they might associate you with?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I mean, you know.
It adds a certain weight to it when you read, like even just in Frog, the story where the character finds out about his brother's death and then he's replaying it over and over in his head, and when you know like how that
my brother actually died that way.
Yeah, that adds a certain layer of
You're right.
Of weight to it. But.
Yeah, but I mean, Frog dies.
Mm-hmm. I know.
I'm still alive.
Mm-hmm.
So when they say you write about yourself too much, I say, well, I mean, a lot of it is just made up.
Mm-hmm.
The trick is to blend them in a way where they don't seem inconsistent or incongruous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I write about my life too, and it's not me necessarily.
Yeah.
I mean, you just take things, but yeah.
And I used to write about. I mean, I know I've written a lot about my wife and 2 daughters. Now I only write about my wife and 1 daughter, because the younger daughter objected to being portrayed so often in my fiction. I said, all right, now I'll just make it 1 daughter, and not necessarily your sister, and not you, but just sort of a blend of the 2 daughters into 1, which is creating a new character,
Mm-hmm.
a new person. And then she came up to me about 2 years ago and said, you could write about me all you want. I said, it's too late. He only has 1 daughter.
Was that ever something that you stressed about when
Yes.
you like writing about your wife? I mean,
Well,
I think those are important stories, but...
It stressed my wife,
Mm-hmm.
which stressed me. And I remember once when somebody was here interviewing me, and he asked her, how does she feel about being portrayed so often in Steve's fiction? She says, I've given up trying to get him to write about something else. Her answer was, that's Steve. It's obviously impossible for him not to write about her. And they are important stories because, you know, I was very much in love with my wife, and she was in love with me, and so it was such a great loss that I can't not put it into fiction.
I don't think that there's any writing out there right now like that.
You don't think what?
I don't think there's any writing out there now that shows so clearly and just without anything held back, without any reservations, like what it's like to take care of another person and the ugliness of some of that, and I mean just how human those stories are.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I have, to add to the question, to add to the answer, there was in the story Last May, which is in my first collection, No Relief.
Mm-hmm.
And in it his father is dying.
Yeah, I've read that.
And he meets a woman and he fucks her in the hospital room with his father and dying in bed. And the story was published. That didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
I met a woman and we became friends. And I think she might have wanted the relationship to go further. And I guess I didn't. And this is a true story. I got a call from somebody that my book, No Relief, is in the window of the 8th Street bookstore on 8th Street in Greenwich Village, because it had been reviewed in a newspaper then called, which was a competitor to the Village Voice, called the Soho News, and they gave it a great review. This is my first book from a small publisher. So I was in the Village, and I went to see my book in the window. It was evening, the store was closed. And this is a true story, and it sounds totally made up. I swear to you, this is true. And I turn around, and there's the woman. And the story, the book No Relief, which is an attractive cover, it's a photograph, is right in the center with a light. You know, and there are books around it, but they sort of put it in a central place. And I didn't want her to see the story, the book. So I stood in front of the book so she wouldn't see it. Maybe she did see it. And we said, "How are you? Fine. And what are you doing?" And so on. I just came down to, buy a book, and the store is closed. And she went away. I think she was she was a student at NYU, something like that. She was going to school, new school, one or the other. So it didn't seem that she had seen the cover of the book, because I didn't want her to read the story and she would see what I did to her. And her mother had died. Her mother had died before my father died. So I felt lousy.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember Dina, another woman, that woman's name was Marlene. Dina, who I lived with for 3-4 years, she was the female protagonist in Quite Contrary. So she didn't want the book to come out because I'd written so much about her. She said, "I'll let your book come out because it had been accepted by Harper and Row if you give me the movie rights for 1 year," because she was a filmmaker. I said, "Okay, you can have the movie rights free, She never made a movie out of it, but she also was PO'd that I had used her. And then there was Bonnie in California, the woman in the title story, What Is All This?, with her 2 children. And she said, "Would I please stop writing about her?" Well, I couldn't. So Bonnie died. Dina is we correspond sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
She remarried. And Marlene, I don't know what happened to her. But I feel she might have eventually seen the story.
Another thing that I don't really have a question about, but there's a lot of sex in your books.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, is that just something you're interested in, or just because
Sure.
it's part of life? I mean.
Yeah, and I'm graphic
Mm-hmm.
without being sleazy. Sure, how could you write about a relationship without writing about the sex life? But I try to make it funny or interesting or different, but certainly not sleazy. Unless the guy is sleazy. Yeah, I know I've written a lot about sex. In fact, the last one, about a year or two ago, Dina had sent me some old letters of mine. So in return, I sent her a book. I wrote her saying, "Could I send you a book of mine?" She says, as long as it doesn't have raw sex in it. Because your books are too raw. She was no prude, but she found them too raw. So I sent her Friends. And when I told my daughters that I sent her Friends, sort of a small collection of stories.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have it?
I do. That's a really little one, right?
Yeah, well, it's about 120 pages.
Mm-hmm.
It's the one with the couple on
it's
the...
It's black cover,
that's
right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's little. And my daughter says, there's sex in this. Oh, I did it again. I forgot. So when you write so many stories, you forget what's in them. Yeah, so, as you say, it's part of life, a very important part of life. In fact, it is life.
Mm-hmm. That's how we're here right now.
That's right.
I don't think you rarely ever read about elderly people having sex, though, as if they just they don't at all.
As if they stop.
But that's something that's refreshing about reading your later work.
Yeah, well, it's so.
Mm-hmm. I was gonna ask you, like, just what's a regular day like for you here? Now here, like when you wake up in the morning.
Well, I get up early because I go to bed early. I go to bed around 9 o'clock or 9:30 after reading for about half an hour in bed. So I get up around 5:36. I let the cat out first so he doesn't shit in the litter box. And even if he does, he wants to go out. So I let him out, and I make myself coffee. My entire breakfast is already in the refrigerator from the previous day, from the previous night. So I don't have too many things to do in the morning after waking up. So I just put the prepared food on the table, which is usually a bowl of fruit, and then a combination of granola, kefir, and something like prunes, and a salad that I had made the day before. I put that on the table. Then I go outside, let the cat in, change its water outside, change its water inside, put its food down on the floor. So while he's eating, I go and get the newspaper, which is by the mailbox. And I come back and I read the newspaper while I have my breakfast. And then I go in back in that room, the bedroom, and I start working. Or I might turn on the computer to see if there are any messages, and also to see if I've missed something, like some city has blown up the previous night. And then I work for about 2-3 hours, on and off. And I usually take a nap for about a half an hour, rest my back. So less a nap than a rest. Then I go to the Y, usually by about 12, 1 o'clock. And then my day is basically free. I might do a shop for food. I might do a little gardening, sort of try and clean up the place as best as I could. And then I'll go back to my work for about an hour or two. And by then it's 4 o'clock. I used to take a run every morning. I have difficulty running, so I take a short, sort of fast walk.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's 4 or 5 o'clock, and I prepare dinner, which is usually prepared for me by the supermarket that I buy prepared food. Although I'll make a rice or a noodle dish. And then I put the prepared food. I know we were just talking about what I do in the morning, but this is my entire day. And every day is just about the same. I prepared my dinner, which is very slight, and I'll put it in the oven for 30 minutes, finish reading the newspaper or the book that I'm reading, read some pages of that, and then sit down in front of the computer. Do you know a lot about computers?
Not too much.
I think mine froze last night, and I hope it's working today.
I can look at it for you, but I don't know too much.
Thank you. And so I'll see if, Morning Joe, I don't like him too much because he interrupts his wife all the time, but I like what he stands for. Not his conservatism, but that he's very frank about Trump. And then what do? If there's I have Netflix. I have Netflix because my daughters share it with me. They haven't had any movies that I want to see. And if they do have a movie, I usually watch about a half an hour of it. And then I go in back and I read and I go to sleep. And I dream and I get up maybe 3 times a night to go to urinate, because like getting up, like just about everybody my age, every male, I have a bladder, prostate problem, which is a pain.
Well, even I get up sometimes just because I drink too much water at nighttime. And it is a pain.
So that's usually my day. It doesn't make a difference if it's Monday or Sunday. Sunday I often go to a place that has good soup. And I get a piece of bread with it. It's called Atwater's. So I sit at the counter and I treat myself to a soup and roll or a piece of bread with butter on it. I've become sort of antisocial, reclusive in the last couple of years. And I know people who want to see me, and I turn down most people because it's become kind of hard. I feel sort of awkward, and I'm embarrassed the way I look sometimes. You see my head, I fall a lot and crack my head open a lot. And I'm afraid if I see people, I might urinate in my pants suddenly, because it comes on very quickly. And with some people, there's just a couple of people, like I'm having no difficulty talking to you, but most people I have difficulty talking with, and I feel sort of dumb, awkward, wrong words, thoughts are scattered. So my social life has sort of narrowed down to just about non-existence. And I have two couples have been very nice to me, and they're real friends, and they would do anything for me. And so I see them about once every 2-3 months. And otherwise, I go to the Y. Did I mention that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's become a big part of some of your stories too.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to ask you, but I forgot.
Yeah, I go every day. I haven't gone today, but I will. And there aren't many people there to talk to, but I like it that there's some action going on. People are sweating and paddling away feverishly on the bikes. And I think it keeps me relatively healthy, other than for the things that I can't cure or make better with exercise. So I do that every day for about an hour, hour and a half. It's also very convenient. It's just 7 minutes away. And it's a new Y, a new building in an old Y. Yeah, my daughters want me to move to Brooklyn so they could see me more. And it would certainly be a relief knowing that I was near them, because they're very capable young women, very smart, and they're both psychotherapists. So I can't fool them. But there are so many things that I have against going to live in New York. The house, that it would upset my life, that I couldn't find a Y as good as the one I have now. Everything is so convenient. I have to get new doctors, new dentists. And I don't want to live in a city. I like, I've let the trees grow around the house. Yeah, sure, it's a big place for one person, but my daughters come down and they each have a room. One has a boyfriend and one doesn't. What were we talking about?
I was just asking you about your day, what your day is like, and you gave me a really good answer.
Yeah, the day is sort of repetitive, but it's not a repetition that I don't like. I mean, I wish I was more articulate so I could be with people better, but I also don't drive at night, and I realize that I'll have to stop driving in a few years. And without the car, I don't know what I'll do. I'll probably have to move to Brooklyn.
And what was it a strange or weird surprise when you got a letter from me? Or just didn't faze you?
I've got letters from other people. Usually they want me to read their manuscripts, which I don't do. No, it was a nice letter you got, and you seemed serious. And I remember you said that you had a reading at that store, which I was impressed by because I guess they have lots of readings, but there are a lot of writers. No, for instance, the guy's doing my biography. His phone call was very much like your letter. And I remember the other couple that I'm friends with, they met because of my work. They both were readers of my work, a woman and a guy. So when they moved in together, they had duplicate copies of some books. But they're very nice. And he started collecting my letters. He wanted to make a book out of my letters. So he wrote to a lot of people who I had known in my life. And he got letters that I had written to them. They had saved them. I haven't read them.
I've still got mine. There's a lot of us out there.
I have. My sister-in-law, the wife of my oldest brother Don, who was killed by a tree. I think it was she who sent me the letters that I had written to my mother and father at various points in my life. And he had ended up with the family archives, and since he was dead, she sent them to me. I think it was Jerry who did that. But I haven't read those letters. I'm sort of not interested in what I was like at 16 and 18 and 20 and 22. You were about 25?
25, yeah.
You are 25.
I won't keep you too much longer.
Don't worry. When you're done, you're done. I wonder where Ashley went.
I don't know, but I'm sure she's having a good time.
She didn't get lost.
Well, I kind of already asked you what you like to do besides write.
I read.
What are you reading right now, by the way?
Well, let's see. I almost finished The Trial for the second time. I read it about 40 years ago. Kafka's. But I didn't like it. It's a new translation, or relatively new. So from that, I went to my favorite writer, Thomas Bernhard, and I reread his book Concrete, which is a brilliant book, short, about 135, 150 pages, terrific book. And then my daughter Antonia is giving a lot of her books away, and I saw one of the books was a book by Roland Barthes called Morning Diary, Mourning, about a diary that he did daily about the death of his mother. So I read that, and there were some good parts to it. It was very, there was 1 or 2 sentences on each page, so it was very quick to read. And yesterday I went to the Ivy Bookshop to see if they could get a book by a Norwegian writer that I like, Dag Solstad, S-O-L.
Okay, yeah.
You know?
I've heard of him, from working at City Lights.
Yes, I read 2 of his books, and I went in to buy, because I knew they wouldn't have it, but for them to order a book that I thought was, it says in the book that I have that this book is going to be published by New Directions, but it hasn't been published yet. It's called Novel 17, book 3, something like that. So I got an old book of his called Singer, T. Singer, which it's the one I was reading when you, at the station. So I like his work.
Is he still alive?
Yes, he's 4 years younger than I am, if not 5 years. But he's a good writer. But I'm really short of books to read.
Mm-hmm.
So I always go back to Thomas Bernhard. And there's some of his books I like better than others.
I've only read one of his books.
What was that?
It was his first novel, which is...
Frost?
Mm-hmm. Which is, I've heard, more difficult, or just not one of his best. But,
no, it's not.
But I'm eager to read more.
Extinction is, people think is his best, but it's not put together as well as his other books.
I had a tonsillectomy when I was on pain pills while I was reading him. It was a strange reading experience.
Yeah.
Kind of in a haze reading Bernhard.
That's what I'm reading.
Is there anything that you wish you had done differently in your writing career or just in your life in general?
Yeah, well, I wish that I hadn't gone along with Playboy. And I wish I hadn't gotten angry at the publisher of Henry Holt for not advertising my books. So he sent me a letter back saying I'm ungrateful, and I'm sure that's why they stopped publishing me. I wish I hadn't done that. It was stupid. And I wish that Melville House, I had done what they wanted, which was to publish What Is All This in individual books rather than together. They said that I insisted on having the 3 books pushed, having all the stories in one volume. And I didn't insist, but I should have been more grateful that they were going broke, which they told me they were, publishing my work. So I wish I had gone along with what they wanted, because then I would have had a publisher for each of my, I think, for all the books that were written after What Is All This. Anything else? Well, I can't think of anything else regarding my work.
What's something that you haven't done yet that you still want to do? And that can be writing or just anything.
Oh, to go back to Paris, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to New York, because I can't walk too far, and I don't want to use a walker. I can't think of anything. You know, life is too short. Like, I could have been a painter. I did a lot of artwork. But painting, it came too easy for me. I was too satisfied too quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't work on it. It just seemed it was right very fast. But you can't, at one time I was doing that and writing at the same time. And I discovered that I had to sort of concentrate on one or the other. So I concentrated on writing. And this is in 1966 or so when I made that decision.
I've only got a few more little things left for you. Can you talk about why you appreciate classical music so much? And maybe to someone who doesn't listen to it, because you've gotten me more interested in it. Ashley's already a big fan.
I started listening to classical music after my brother Richard, who's my second oldest brother, went into the Navy. So that when he was 8 years older, and he went into the Navy at 18. So I was 10. And he left all his records in the basement. And my father used to listen to semi-classical music, you know, Mantovani, if you know who he is. Sort of sweet showbiz music. But I went to the basement of the house that we lived in, the apartment building, the brownstone rather, on West 75th Street. And I saw his record collection there. And he also left his Victrola, his record player. So I would play his records. They were jazz. He was interested in jazz. One was by Dizzy Gillespie. And it said, based on the theme of Rachmaninoff, his second symphony. And it goes, da-dee, da-da-da-da. Full Moon and Empty Hearts was turned into a popular song. But the music is from Rachmaninoff. And so I sought out Rachmaninoff. And then I sought out Tchaikovsky, because he was Russian, as Rachmaninoff was. And then I sought out Chopin, because he was Polish, close to Russia. And I got interested right away in classical music based on Dizzy Gillespie, and also based on a very funny connection. The teacher in the public school, PS 87, played the class when I was in 5th or 6th grade, Tubby the Tuba.
I'm just laughing at the name.
Yeah. Well, it was about Tubby the Tuba, where the tuba player gets no recognition at all. He's like a joke in a band, in a marching band. But then there comes a time when they need a tuba to play this tuba piece. That's Tubby the Tuba. And so I liked the music. It was supposed to be a joke. So I liked Tubby the Tuba. I liked Dizzy Gillespie's rendition of Full Moon and Empty Hearts. And so I got more and more interested in classical music when I was 10 years old. And I also played the piano. You couldn't teach me how to play the piano. Everything was extemporaneous. I had an ear for music. So my mother played the piano. She played the piano like it should be played. My sister Pat played the piano, and my sister Bunny, and my brother Jimmy played the piano. But I couldn't take lessons. I can't take lessons. That's why I was such a bad student in everything that I did, because I can't take lessons. But I can sit down at the piano and play. Not now, but then. So I was interested in, so I would play my own, I would make up compositions. Dixon Sonata, I couldn't read music. Anyway, that's how I got interested in classical music. And then it really developed. In fact, now I have very few records left, but I gave them my whole record collection to, just about 90% of my record collection, to this one guy who's collecting my letters. Because there's a good radio station in Baltimore, WBJC. It's a classical music station, 24 hours a day. So it's another reason for living in Baltimore. I mean that seriously, because they have a good music station. So music has always brought me great solace, great comfort. And the women that I went to, that I met and lived with, or cohabited with, before Anne, my wife, none of them were interested in classical music, which I felt was something missing in our relationship. And Anne was, the first time I went up to her apartment, I see she has a record collection, and among the records are Bach's motets. I said, who has Bach motets? And it's such a rare thing to have a recording of. And she had it and I had it. You know, the same records. I said, this is the gal for me. Because she loved music as much as I did, and she played the piano. So music brought us together closer. brought us closer than we would be without it. We went to concerts, we went to opera. In the summer we went to Kneisel Hall for chamber music concerts in Maine. Yes, so music has been very important in my life. I'm glad you asked.
It's a nice thing in reading your books now too, because I can so easily look up these things, on the computer and listen to them. I think. Let's see. Well, what's a question you wish someone would ask you, maybe that no one's asked you? And it's okay if there isn't one.
It's a good question. Why do I write?
Mm-hmm.
I write because what would I do without writing? I mean, I didn't know when I started writing that this would be my life. This would be the thing that carried me through all my professions, carried me through life, that gave me the greatest enjoyment. Not, enjoyment, not like sex, not like food, not like good wine. It's just something to do every day. It became that. It wasn't that in the beginning. In the beginning, I just wrote stories, and they were taking, they weren't taking. I was serious, but not as serious as I am now. And I became more serious as a writer the older I got. So now I'm more serious. I'm a more serious writer than I ever was. Yeah. And another question is, which is my favorite book? I guess my two favorite books. I like them all. I guess my two favorite books are Frog and 30, because I think they went further than I at the time that I was writing them than I've gone with any two books at the time I was writing them. And I think the one I'm writing now, I'm going far with. I'm sort of letting. Well, I think the book, his wife leaves him, also sort of goes pretty far in the chances I took with it. I know a lot of people don't like the fact that the paragraphs are too long and that there's no linear dialogue, but I like them. Anyway, I like all my books.
Is there any, well, I was going to say, what would you tell, maybe you don't care, but why should someone read your work?
Yeah, that's a question that in the New York Times, usually on Monday or Friday, they review a book by interviewing the author. Mm-hmm. And the last question is, could you in 50 words tell us why someone should read your book? And I would say, I can't in 50 words. And nobody has to read my book. Mm-hmm. The only thing that's important to me is that I have something to write. And one reason it's important to me is that if I'm not writing something, if I don't have a page to go to the following day, I get very irritable with myself. And so I need to know when I stop writing, let's say today, that I have a page to write tomorrow. That's why when I write a first draft of something, it's there, I just have to sort of write off the skeleton of the book. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And if I don't have something, if I finish, let's say, a story, what am I going to write tomorrow? Because I always have to have something to write. And Frog took me maybe 4 years to write, 4.5 years. And when I finished it, I didn't really have a publisher for it. I had somebody who was interested. I started something the next day. Somebody else might say, why don't you take a break? Give your mind some time to clear. I said, because something will come if I sit down at the typewriter. And I had lots of sort of one-liners that might be good lines to start off a story with, or some concepts that might be a good story if I just sit down and write it. So that's been the way I've written all my life. Once I started writing books, I finish a story and start another story the next day. finish a novel and start a novel or a short story the next day. And this makes me happy. You know, it makes me sort of not nervous about what I'm going to do for that day. In the old days when I lived in New York and I would finish a story, I would always walk it down to the copy center on 40th Street and Madison Avenue and get it copied 3 or 4 times, and then walk home, stop at a Chocolate Nuts at 56th Street it was. Chocolate Nuts was a...
Coffee?
Yeah, coffee, and the date nut bread, cream cheese and date nut bread. I mean, I didn't have much money, so I would limit myself to a mug of coffee and the date nut bread, cream cheese date nut bread sandwich. Then I would go home, and by the time I got home, I might have an idea for a story the following day, which I might then start that evening. Only once, when I was walking to, this is a true story, when I was walking to the copy center, and that would be from 75th Street all the way down to 40th Street on Madison Avenue. And I'd walk back, not a big walk. While I was walking to the copy center, I would usually walk on Central Park South, because there's an interesting avenue. You know Central Park South. And some guy burst out at me. He was in front of the Russian tea room. And he said, "You must be famous, could you give me your signature?" And so I told him I wasn't famous and so on and so on. And he said, anyway, I said, "I'm a writer and I'm not doing too well." He said, "Well, one day you might be famous." So so I wrote my signature. I gave it to him. I walked to the end of the block, continuing on my way to the copy center on 40th Street and Madison Avenue. And I got the idea for the story, signatures. So I stood there, got a pen. I always had a pad in my back pocket and a pen in my side pocket, and wrote the entire first draft of the story standing on the corner of Central Park South and 57th Street. Central Park South, which was 59th Street. And then I wrote the first draft, and then continued, and felt very good, because now I didn't have to wait till I got home to start a story. I already had the first draft of the story for tomorrow. And when I wrote a first draft, I would never then start rewriting it that day. I would always let it sit for a day, and then start rewriting it or making it into a complete story the following day. If the story is, and we go back to almost the first question that you asked me in this interview, we go back to what I was talking about then. You remember?
Well, we've kind of jumped all over the place.
Yeah.
But kind of like frog. But that's good. I don't know. I don't think I have any. I think I actually went through all of these. Is there anything you wanna talk about? I think we did a good one.
I hope so. So I usually average in a year about $2,000 from all the foreign publications and short stories I get in magazines. And then one year, Harper's Magazine, the last story they took, they gave me $4,000, so that was real money. I don't need it, I live very frugally. I have Social Security. I have, sort of what you would call a pension from working 27 years at Hopkins. And so now when a publisher is interested in my work, I don't even talk money. Talk art.
We'll see.
You just keep at it.
Yeah. I'm not too stressed about it, and I mean.
Well, you're a smart guy.
People like you are an inspiration, though. Just, I mean, the work especially, but also just doing it for yourself more than
right.
anything else. And it doesn't need to be a race to go publish right away.
Yeah, that goes back to my Playboy story when they changed the ending and it came out. It was a big deal. In fact, I was in Morocco and got off the boat and got off the ferry in Morocco from Spain to Morocco, and there was a guy with a pile this high of that month's Playboy. So, but they changed it, and I was, as I say, mortified by the change, and told myself, if I really want to be a writer, never agree to a change that you don't agree with. And I've kept to that, sort of my own way. I didn't become a successful writer in the sense of selling, living off my income, but I had my job, Hopkins. It's always good to have a job. And I was able to, I had enough energy in me to take care of a wife, take care of myself, take care of a job, and write.
And you are a different kind of success story too.
That's right.
I mean, you've put out 30-something books.
35.
Yeah.
Yeah, the one you have is 36, and the one I'm writing is 37. And there's one novel that I never had published. It's called Fish, but I'm gonna not publish it. It's not good.
When was that one from?
But that was finished after Tish, so I was still in my late 20s. No, I think I was thinking of, I don't know, I haven't reread the book, but it's a big book. And it just every time I start to reread it to see if I want to rewrite it, I don't like what I see. It has sort of a commercialness to it that would destroy, I think, all my other books. That's the thing, when you're a writer, you have to write stuff. If it's going to be published, you have to sort of stand by it. And if it's just shit, commercial shit, then that's what you wrote. And you have to live with that. I think most writers sort of sell out. Do you have any favorite American writers?
Well,
or any writers?
Well, I would say seriously you, but aside from you, when I was in college, it was like Leonard Michaels.
Oh yeah, those are two good.
Really,
two collections.
Yeah, those stories really got me excited about writing. When I was in high school, like Cormac McCarthy, and
yeah, I can understand that.
Yeah, I haven't read him since, but
so he's so violent.
That's a
so in
cowboy
school,
books, like high art cowboy
kissing
books.
horses.
I'm trying to think who. I liked Philip Roth. This is in high school.
Have you read Grace Paley?
Oh, I do like Grace Paley too.
Yeah, she's funny.
How did you know her?
Yes, I knew her through my wife. My wife went to Sarah Lawrence and wrote poetry and fiction. She later stopped writing fiction and just wrote poetry. In fact, I got a book of her poems published. And Grace was one of her teachers, and after she graduated, Anne went on to graduate work and PhD in Russian literature, but Grace remained a friend. Yeah, so I got to know her a little, not like Anne did. I got to know her through Anne. And she taught in our department at Hopkins for 1/2 a year. I brought her in. And she was a nice lady. And real. But she didn't write enough. She was sort of an activist. So she did good things in her activism against the war, for the environment, and various things like that, which I didn't do. I wrote. So she wrote really 3 collections of short stories and a book of poems. And she died when she was about 85, 90 years old. but she was a great activist. Anybody else?
I like reading Frederick Bartholomew
Yeah, he's
more than Donald. Yeah.
Yeah. He studied in our program, Frederick.
Oh yeah.
But 2 years before I got there. But Stephen Bartholomew, the third brother.
Oh yeah, I've read some of his stories too.
And he studied with me and John Barth. He was already a writer.
Yeah, I mean, I went through like a little Don DeLillo phase, but it's funny. I was just reading his early stuff when I was younger, so I only read his first 3 books, which are not the books that people tend to talk about. But yeah,
He never excited me.
he's a little too.
Well, too today, in the sense of politics.
Yeah, I think sometimes too just complicated for complicated sake. Sometimes.
I guess I miss those.
Yeah.
I don't read any American writers.
Who are your favorite? Like, do you have any who are contemporary, like foreign writers?
Just Thomas Bernhard. I like this guy Solstad.
Did you ever read Peter Handke?
Oh yeah, I think I read a lot of Peter Handke. I should mention him too. I love his book, The Left-Handed Woman.
I still haven't read that one.
Which is a novella.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a terrific book. I liked Malcolm Lowry for a long time, read everything that he wrote. I liked William Saroyan, read everything he wrote. This is when I was in my 20s, Lowry into my 30s and 40s. But yeah, Peter Handke.
Yeah, I read that Slow Letter,
Yeah.
something like Long Farewell. That book, I read that.
So you're reading the good writers. You're some good writers. I used to bring a book with me when I go to a supermarket, so I could read it on the supermarket when I go to a post office and there'd be a line. But I get so many stares and questions. And you said that there's very little culture in the area that you live in now.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when I go in the Y, I don't know how many people say, "What do you do? What are you reading? Oh, you're a writer?" I said, "Yes." They're totally uninterested.
People really don't read where we live very much. I can tell that they think it's strange that I come in every day with a book under one arm. Like, I kind of hide it, actually.
Yeah.
Not because I'm ashamed, but I just don't want to talk about it, really.
Yeah.
But yeah. It's hard to hide frog when you're, when you're bringing a brick to work
What
every
about
day.
30?
Yeah. I still haven't read that one yet.
Jesus.
But I read Gould, but I haven't
Well,
read.
that at least is small.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I got some fat books.
Well, I think we're good on this. If you feel good about it.
Yes, I do.